Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Welcome. My name is Matt Taylor, and I am the Protestant scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. And this is one of our monthly programs that we do on various topics. I'm very excited about the conversation that we get to have here today. I'm not sure if all of our US-based audience is aware of this, but today is actually a very significant anniversary in the Western Hemisphere. Today is the 1-year anniversary of the riots that occurred in Brasilia, in the capital of Brazil, 1 year ago. And this was not just in terms of the timing of year, but the events that transpired that day called to mind for many people the events that occurred 3 years ago on January 6th, where we saw the storming of the US Capitol. And so we have two fantastic scholars who I have the privilege of calling friends, who are going to be helping us walk through the events of a year ago and putting those in conversation with what happened in the US 3 years ago, and thinking especially about the religious dimensions of these two apparent insurrections, or at least attempted insurrections that we've seen. So let me introduce our panelists and do a little bit of introductions around what we're talking about, and then we'll launch in. So I'll just note at the top that for those of you who registered for this event, you might have seen that we were going to have a third panelist, Erica Briand Ramirez. Unfortunately, she had an administrative emergency come up that pulled her away today. And so we'll be talking to two of her colleagues, and we'll hopefully be able to do something with her in the future, because she's another phenomenal scholar working in this space. So let me introduce my colleagues here. João Chavez is an assistant professor of the history of religion in the Americas in the Department of Religion at Baylor University. And his research focuses on the history of religion in the Americas, the influence of US Protestantism in Latin America, and the development of Latin America and Latinx religious networks in the United States. Dr. Chavez is an award-winning author, and his books include Migrational Religion, Context and Creativity in the Latinx Diaspora, which came out from Baylor in 2021. He also wrote The Global Mission of the Jim Crow South, Southern Baptist Missionaries and the Shaping of Latin American Evangelicalism. That came out from Mercer University Press in 2022. We are also joined by Raimundo Cesar Barreto Jr. He is an associate professor of world Christianity at Princeton Theological Seminary. He earned a PhD in religion and society from Princeton, and he holds degrees also from Mercer University and the Seminario Teológico Batista do Norte do Brasil. Did I get that pronunciation anywhere close, Raimundo? Okay. His most recent publications include Protesting Poverty, Protestants, Social Ethics, and the Poor in Brazil. That came out from Baylor University Press in 2023. He has co-edited volumes, including Alterity and the Evasion of Justice, Race, Gender, Sexuality, and Explorations of the Other in World Christianity, with Deanna Womack, who has also done things with us here at ICJS. We greatly appreciate her scholarship. And he's also written or edited Decolonial Horizons, Reimagining Theology, Ecumenism, and Sacramental Practice. He is also one of the conveners of the Princeton World Christianity Conference, co-editor of the Journal of World Christianity, and he is finalizing a monograph titled Base Ecumenism, a Latin American Contribution to Ecumenical Praxis and Theology. And he's also working on a book called Christians in the City of Sao Paulo, The Shaping of World Christianity in a Brazilian Megacity. So these are not scholars who are kind of resting on their laurels. These are two scholars, and I would say this of Erica as well, who are just producing phenomenal work on these topics. And I just highly commend their scholarship and their work to you. These are the type of people as people who care about religion that you want to be following. They're just doing some really important work. And I'll just also note that both Raimundo and João and also Erica have also been helping out putting together a documentary that will be coming out this year. And the title of that is Apocalypse in the Tropics. That is actually about the Brasilia riots and some of the crisis in democracy that has been going on in Brazil and the religious dimensions of that. So note that. Keep an eye out for that documentary when it comes out. I think it's going to be excellent and be a very helpful resource to many of us who are trying to understand some of the transnational dimensions of what we're seeing with religious nationalism. So let me start, though, by talking a little bit about some of my own area of scholarship, and then we're going to put that very much in conversation with João and Raimundo and their understanding of what happened a year ago in Brazil. So as many of you know, for the last 3 years, I've been working on the understanding the networks of Christian leaders and Christian influence that helped contribute to what happened on January 6th. Many scholars, many journalists have noted the plethora of religious expressions, religious symbols, Christian music, Christian imagery, Christian prayers, Christian biblical citations that were on display on January 6, 2021. Of course, the agenda of January 6, 2021 was an attempt to overturn the 2020 election, to reinstate Donald Trump for a second term. So it was an overtly political event. And many people, in our tendency to separate religion and politics or think those things are completely different categories, understood this as a overtly political event. But when you actually look at the manifestations of it, when you look at how it played out, when you look at who was there, when you look at how the people who were there framed their participation that day, we see religion everywhere. There were people carrying various flags, like Christian flags. And this is a more of a US phenomenon, but you have this flag that is labeled the Christian flag that is typically used by evangelicals today. And there were dozens of Christian flags flying around the Capitol. There were also other flags that had very much of a Christian gloss to them. Things like the Appeal to Heaven flag that has become popular with Christian nationalist leaders. And some of what I have shown, and we've done a number of events on it here at ICJS. We have a documentary coming out this month about it. I've shown that underlying so much of those Christian manifestations, so many of the different forms of Christianity that were expressed and noted on January 6th, there's a very strong influence coming out of what we could call the independent charismatic world. These are Christians who are non-denominational, who do not belong to kind of traditional denominations, and who are charismatic, who care deeply about supernatural manifestations, who care deeply about what Christians talk about as the gifts of the Holy Spirit, and who want to recreate the energy and spirituality of the early church and bring that into modernity. And especially, as I've highlighted in my network or in my research, there's a particular network or set of networks of Christian leaders who are very, very influential. In my book, I even call them the principal theological architects of January 6th. And this is a movement that goes by the title of the New Apostolic Reformation. Again, if you are interested in going any deeper on those things, I can point you to a number of different things that I've published and that we've put forward in the last year. But today, what I'd like to do is focus in on the event of a year ago. These riots that we saw occurring in Brasilia. And we have João and Raimundo here to help point us to that and guide us through understanding that. So I'll throw some questions out to both of you and allow you to respond freely. But maybe we could just start with what happened a year ago today. What occurred? Some of us may have noticed it in the news or read articles about it, but maybe those things have faded from our memory in the last year. It's been an eventful year. So what happened a year ago, and why was it significant?
So, let me first thank you for the invitation to be part of this conversation. It's so important. And also, thank you for the very generous introduction. I was in Brazil a year ago with 20 students from Princeton Theological Seminary. So I'll try to give you an impression from a Brazilian perspective of what happened a year ago. And then I think we can put that into a bigger context. So I was in a Sorry, I had something on my screen here. I was in a favela, a slum area of Brazil, in another part of Brazil, talking to a group of women who have been dealing with violence against women, not only in the broader society, but also in the churches. When we left that conversation, then we just heard the news that all the main buildings of the democratic institutions in Brasilia had been invaded and were being vandalized, which means the Supreme Court, the Congress, in the presidential palace. So that's a difference also, just for us to begin to notice comparisons. It was not only the Congress, but the three main representative buildings of Brazilian democracy. How could that happen? Have happened was a question that everybody was asking. And of course, for that to happen, you had to have insiders would allow access for people coming from not only Brasilia, but people being brought into Brasilia by paid buses. People are busing to Brasilia, thousands of people, maybe 5,000 more. And they in a couple of hours, they took over the three main buildings, and they took over the buildings, whereas raising the Bible in their hands, praying out loud, singing hymns, and proclaiming that now that place belonged to the Lord Jesus. So not everybody was an evangelical in that crowd, but a good number of them were evangelicals, professing evangelicals. Now, from the perspective of Brazil, that was a terrorizing view because of our history. Because just 60 years ago, in 1964, the last time that we saw Brazilian being shaken was during a military coup d'etat. So we had a military coup d'etat, and Brazil has had authoritarian regimes since its foundation as a republic in 1889. 88, and that history caused pause on many people, including me and my students who had read a big book on Brazilian history, and we were not sure about what was going to happen afterwards. What was happening there was a kind of an alliance between a group that called themselves the People, so a populist movement, led by a populist former president, and that's another difference. Bolsonaro was no longer in power. He was leading from afar. And contrary to the situation here with Trump being there, Bolsonaro was no longer president. So how could they overturn the election if Bolsonaro was no longer president? So they had the people, they had the military, and that was the combination, and the religion. So the people, this populist movement, believing that God was asking them to change things back and save the country from a left-wing corrupt government, bring back their Messiah, this president that they associate with somebody who would enforce the values of the church on the country. But how could that happen? Only through a military intervention. And since the election, many of these people had been camping outside the military headquarters of the country, including the one in Brasilia, asking for military intervention and praying every day for military intervention. That would be God's way for things to happen. The only reason why they didn't succeed was that the military didn't back them up at the end of the day. So the police did. That's why they accessed the buildings, because the local police allowed them to do that. But the generals or most of them didn't allow that to happen because also of what had happened here, because the US didn't support it differently from 1964, when the coup was backed up by the US government. In 2023, the Biden administration clearly said no. And the Brazilian military said, we are not going to get into this. So it left the crowd a little orphan in that sense, because the alliance was broken at the end of the day. That's my perception of somebody who was there that day.
If I could add to that, since 2021, international leaders that were already in connection to some Brazilian leaders in the U.S. and abroad, already sensing what could come in the Brazilian situation, also pressured some statements that were put out condemning any kind of military coup that could come. So some people were for a long time kind of seeing the writing on the wall that this could happen, and that came out of some of the statements that Bolsonaro himself had made, and other places as well. So so another element of this also that's important to see the transnational connection there between the Trump administration and the Bolsonaro administration is that Steve Bannon was the campaign manager for both for Trump, but also continued in this relationship with the Bolsonaro family and the Bolsonaro administration. As a matter of fact, he said more than once that what Bolsonaro could accomplish in Brazil was even more powerful than what Trump could accomplish here. So you see those connections there, but just to spotlight again something that Raimundo said, despite these connections, what happened in Brazil, it was a lot more dangerous in many ways. Some of us I wasn't in Brazil when that happened. I was coming back from a conference, American Historical Association in Philly, when I was in an Amtrak back to Princeton, for which I worked at the time, and I looked at my text, and people were texting me, "Are you seeing what's happening?" When I looked at what's happening, first thing that came to mind, it's happening again. The kind of coup that established the dictatorship, a different version of it, but nevertheless similar outcomes. The dictatorship under which both Raimundo and I were born. So this is recent memory for some of us in significant ways. And if in 1964, again, the U.S. signaled a green light for the support of what happened, the Biden administration did not. One could only wonder what would happen if Trump had been re-elected here, what kind of administration we would be under in Brazil now. So it was a situation with some overlap, but more dangerous in many ways, given the history of Brazil and the fragile democratic structures there.
May I just complement something, because I think you touching on a very important point that I was thinking that we could discuss later, but I think it's a good moment. There would be no January 8th, 2023 without January 6th, 2021. And so that was not an accident. The question that is whether these were parallels, were parallel events. João and I have called it twin insurrections. And I like the twin because twins mean similarities, but also particularities, right? Individualities. There are particularities, but the fact is, this was rehearsed in Brazil a couple of times. September 6, 2021, just a few months after January 6. Bolsonaro was calling for kind of the end of the Supreme Court in Brazil. He was rebelling against the democratic institutions, and that's the September 7th is the Brazilian Independence Day. And he called his followers to go to Brasilia and actually try that day to show his power and challenge the Supreme Court that he saw as his enemy at the time, because they were about to judge some of his already at that point crimes against the electoral system. He was putting the electoral system into question at that point. So Jason Miller from the Trump campaign was there. Steve Bannon was also following that and met with Eduardo Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro's son, in November of 2021. They were believing that what had failed in the US would be accomplished in Brazil, and that the Brazilian insurrection would become a kind of a referential, kind of an example of success to be followed by others around the world. Remember that in minds like Steve Bannon's, this is a worldwide movement. He calls it the movement. And Eduardo Bolsonaro, who is a congressman in his own capacity, but also the former president's son, was one of the post-childs or children of the movement. So Bolsonaro was getting guidance from Bannon on how to make it work in Brazil. They tried twice, tried in November or in September 2021, they failed. They tried again in December of 2022, after the election, before the legitimization of the election, but after the election have happened, they failed again. And then they tried once again and almost succeeded. They didn't succeed for, it was a very, very little, because they were expecting the situation to be so chaotic that President Lula would be forced to call on the army to secure the capital. And if he had done that, the army would have the power to make decisions, to declare that the situation required an intervention. So, so this was rehearsed and prepared and planned with collaboration from people from the Trump administration. So if it didn't happen because the US didn't support, it almost happened because it was also done in collaboration, conversation with people from not only from the US, but a good amount of them from the US.
And am I correct in remembering that one of Bolsonaro's sons was also present in Washington, D.C. for January 6th?
He was. The same
right.
one. He was on the 5th. He was here on the 6th too, but we have images of him visiting the White House on the 5th, and also dining with Steve Bannon and wearing a MAGA hat.
Yeah, that's right.
And one of the things I really deeply, deeply appreciate about both of your scholarship is we sometimes have these simplistic narratives that either remake the world in the image of the United States, or that assume that the United States is this all-powerful entity that just spreads influence around the world. And both of you, what I really love about your work is you highlight these international and transnational connections, but you don't oversimplify them, right? And so we're seeing like American policy making has a huge impact on Brazil, right? And the choice of the Biden administration not to endorse a military coup in this instance was very gravitationally important. We also see that there are these transnational networks that are attempting to, in many ways, overturn the democratic order in both of these countries, and are looking for kind of twin inspirations, and are kind of ping-ponging back and forth and saying, well, maybe the US instance in 2021 can inspire a revolution in Brazil in 2023, and maybe that revolution will then inspire something different in the United States again, right? And so there are these elements that are linking these countries together. I'm assuming that some in our audience, including probably myself, are not that well versed in the politics and the way that religion operates in Brazil. So could you just give a little bit of a brief summary? I think that many people tend to think of Brazil as a Catholic country, as a predominantly Catholic country. Can you talk a little bit about some of the changing and shifting religious demographics in Brazil, and how does that intersect with politics and a figure like Bolsonaro?
I'll speak a little bit about the past, and João can bring the most recent picture into the conversation. So just for us to have a bigger picture, Brazil was a colony of Portugal, and so a Catholic colony for more than 300 years. It became an independent modern state in 1822, and a republic. First was a monarchy, then a republic in 1889. So religion, especially Christianity, Catholic Christianity, was always part of the political life in the country. And when that was questioned, because the constitution of the republic actually was following the American Constitution and promote the separation of church and state, that became a problem for the Catholic Church. Which felt that they were losing space and authority and influence. And they had a movement in the 1930s called the reaction, the Catholic reaction. That was meant to actually bring Catholic influence back to the public space. So they created a Catholic electoral league to elect Catholics to power, following and using two things: the Catholic action call from Pope Pius XI, which meant to get the laity involved in Christianizing society, and the movement of integralism, which was a Brazilian version of fascism, which became important as a Brazilian movement exported to the US and to other parts of the world. But it means that what we're seeing today has been part of the Brazilian history for a long time, but mostly up to the coup d'etat of 1964, predominantly on the Catholic side. And again, all this transnational. In 1964, Father Patrick Peyton from the US and the Rosary Crusades were invited and supported by the CIA to lead crusades in South America, but mainly in Brazil. And crusades were very anti-communist, preparing the way for what ended up being a coup d'etat, military coup d'etat in 1964. Up to that point, although some Protestants were involved, they were a tiny minority. And most of this was a kind of Christian nationalism already, but a very Catholic one. So what changed then? I will let João tell you what changed from that point on, and why we're seeing this I would say, protagonism of evangelicals and Pentecostals today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Raimundo. Yeah, so to back up a bit, I mean, if I could back up a bit, some of the streams that we see as being very powerful today, and sometimes that's surprising to some people, start in enclaves of Confederate exiles in the late 1800s, right? So, and some of the missionary history that kind of, in some ways, establish institutions of cultural production that grow with the growth of Protestantism, have a complex genealogy that I won't go into all the details, but anyway, they continue to have influence until the dictatorship that Raimundo traced kind of the story of come about. Now, when the dictatorship comes in the 1960s, there is also a liberal progressive wing of the Catholic Church, what becomes later known as liberation theology. It comes out of those progressive moves within the church. And the dictatorship, which was a US support dictatorship, was very much a dictatorship of the right. In addition to the increasing urbanization of Brazilian society, the implementation of mass media and other things that are already happening before the coup, that in some ways become avenues that Pentecostals and non-Pentecostal Protestants use very effectively to recruit others to their way of being Christian. We also have then a dictatorship that gives a few privileges to Protestants as a way to repress the liberal wing of the Roman Catholic Church that they don't want to see the influence in the country grow. And it is during this period between the 60s, 64 to 85 is a dictatorship, that you see a lot of growth, explosive growth within Protestantism, and then after the 80s, that growth continues. When Brazil redemocratizes, or in the process of redemocratization in the second half of the 1980s, you then already see many Protestant politicians elected to the legislatures, and that again continues to grow. You have the evangelical caucus that is a very powerful there in Brazil also, and the demographic shifts continue to come very explosively within Brazilian society, to the extent that when I was born in 1980, Brazil was still counted as being a overwhelmingly Catholic country. It is projected that by 2032, less than 10 years from now, Brazil will be a majority Protestant country, and the overwhelming part of that Protestant wing has this evangelical Pentecostal edge, charismatic edge to their dispositions that come not unlike some of the white evangelical expressions in the U.S. with particularly conservative social political commitments. So that's kind of part of the demographic religious background that kind of inform the country, I think, from the 1800s perhaps to now. So and those are very vociferous edges of the Brazilian population, and organized to.
And just to highlight for our audience, the backstory here of ex-Confederates becoming settlers in Brazil and missionaries to Brazil is something that João writes about in his book, The Global Mission of the Jim Crow South. So if you're like, that sounds like a wild story, there's an entire academic book on that story written by João, and I commend it to you again, because just recognizing the ways that the relationships between these two countries and the ways that these influences flow across these borders is so important to understanding these events. So I want to focus in on then religion, and Raimundo talked some about the manifestations of religion that you could see in the Brasilia riots, people holding up their Bibles, people singing hymns. How would you characterize the religion that was there? Not just it's Christian, what forms of Christianity were being invoked? What were the networks or the denominations or the religious background of the Christians who tended to participate that day? And what was the role of religious leaders in driving people or encouraging people to participate in this riot, this takeover of government buildings a year ago?
The participation was huge, and I was so we were actually visiting Brazil for the documentary a few months ago, and we talked with some people in the Congress, the Brazilian Congress, and we got a little bit of the background of what was happening. And some people say that one of the reasons why we don't have yet names of who financed the insurrection is because there is an attempt to protect the churches, and especially the big leaders. But there was a huge convocation for that, and in some cases already documented funding from churches to get people to Brasilia for that event. Now, how did we come to that? So João was saying that this was a country where evangelicals were a minority, began to grow in the 70s, and then came as a public actor in the 80s. First, to say we have to elect people. We have to elect people to Congress. We have to elect people who will represent us. And I would say that at that first moment, the idea was more of a minority, a religious minority, trying to get protection and say, this is a Catholic country. Catholics have all what they want. We don't have what we need. So let's try to get people there to be a voice for us. But with the growth that continued to happen in the 90s and in this century, and some of the contemplations, that's the one that João just mentioned, that they can become a majority very soon. There was and the theological encouragement of relationship that they developed with groups like the Dominion theology. They began to think that the mandate was different. The mandate was now to take command, to actually Christianize the country, do what others failed to do before, and now to bring the country to the submission, to submission to Christian principles, which is very similar to the language that is used here. And first they tried to elect a president. So the president, it would be the main office. They have elected mayors, governors, people for Congress. They have maybe 25% of the Congress today is evangelical, Pentecostal. But for them, the symbolism of making Brazil belong to the Lord Jesus, a very evangelical phrase, was electing a president. They failed to elect an evangelical president. And then came Bolsonaro, who is not an evangelical, but we have talked about him as a pan-Christian president, because he managed to do something that no other person had done. One of the reasons why the evangelical candidates failed was that they didn't appeal to the Catholics. They appealed to evangelical, but not to the Catholics, so they didn't have enough votes. Bolsonaro is a Catholic who allowed himself to be baptized by a Pentecostal pastor in the Jordan River, who is married to a Pentecostal woman who became the first lady, who was speaking in tongues when he fulfilled the promise that he had made to his base, that he would put a terribly evangelical judge in the justice, the Supreme Court. So evangelicals have never felt so close to power in Brazil as they felt under Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro allowed them. He created some problems for them because they had always talked about character, about a certain way of being that he doesn't represent. And in that sense, I think they took something from what was happening in the US when the evangelicals here had to deal with the same problems with Trump. And then they begin to talk about Trump as a sider, as somebody who is used by God, even if not necessarily being in the case of Trump and Bolsonaro, a Christian in the way they wish these people were. But they were people advancing an agenda that they identified as the Christian agenda to the country. And that agenda in Brazil was clearly drawn from these past movements, this integralism and other movements which had God, country, family, and country as the major emphasis. So is God above everything, the country above every God above everyone, the country above everything, and then a family, a traditional family kind of proposal, the protection of the family as being the political agenda led by Bolsonaro and his administration. So that was, I think, what convinced many Pentecostals, and of course through their leaders, convinced them to embrace Bolsonaro as one of them.
I want Joao to speak to this as well in just a minute, but I want to, for our audience, we're going to pivot in a few minutes to audience questions. So if you have questions for any of us, feel free to put those in the chat. There's one in the chat. You'll see somebody who has labeled themselves submit questions here. That's where you're supposed to submit the questions. And we'll try to field as many of those questions as possible. But Joao, maybe you could speak as well to what was the religious character of this attempted insurrection, of these riots? Who were the religious leaders involved, and why would you characterize this as being inflected with Christianity?
Yeah, like Raimundo said, I mean, there are videos. You can search that, of people speaking in tongues in the invaded governmental buildings. Many Brazilian flags with the slogan that Bolsonaro had said before. Brazil translates something that Brazil above all and God above everything. Right. So pastors organized caravans with buses to take their people there to Brasilia. So I mean, people talking about Christian Zionism, people with shofars there, also using them. I mean, it was everywhere. Some religious leaders who were influencers used social media to celebrate or even influence that. They took their posts down. Some of them did anyway, after they saw that could be a legal problem, which it became. So I mean, you see that happening in ways that is undeniable. How religious language and self-understandings of religious motivations were part of that. As Raimundo mentioned, this idea of having a president who represents that the country belongs to Jesus, and what that means, which among many things means also legislations that continue to exclude people who contradict evangelical social morality, right? So we can talk a little more about that if it's important. So you see that happening, and also, again, those are long-standing relationships of the right-wing politics and part of Brazilian conservative Christianity. If I could step back a little bit chronologically, but to talk about something we discussed, these mutual influences between US and Brazil, you have historians who have argued that it is during the dictatorship that Brazil, in some ways, served as training grounds and as offering models to what's going to become the religious right in the US, to the extent that the religious right is co-created between Brazil and US. So these transnational relationships are happening in the same way that the insurrection in the US, as Raimundo mentioned, in some ways offer a model for what it's going to happen in Brazil. And that comes with particularly Christian ways of articulating what that means for the country, and also particular national myths. Right? How do you then read the history of the country and that got us here? I remember, and I'll end with this, that I was in Brazil for research. I was in a Baptist seminary in Recife. I was looking at in their archives, and a number of pastors came in talking to younger people about when they were trained there. And then they started talking about being there in the 60s when the military coup took place, and they kept on saying that, talking about the revolution, right? Talking about something positive that had happened, that takeover of power meant a protection. So really buying into the narrative of those who kind of usurped power in Brazil in the 60s. So you see that there is lots of organization there, and they are multi-directional and touch on many things, long-standing relationships and even national myths that are religiously legitimated in explicit ways.
I was reading in the New York Times today, there were some religion reporters who were in Iowa talking to evangelical voters before the Iowa caucuses this month. And there was an evangelical voter who gave what might be the best one-line summary of Christian support for Donald Trump that I've read. And her summary was, Trump is our David and our Goliath.
Mm.
And it sounds like there's a similar dynamic at play in the Christian support for Bolsonaro, a recognition that he is not a good human being, that he has this side of being a bully, of being a giant who wants to beat up on people and potentially even enslave people, right? Goliath is trying to enslave people. But then at the same time, there's this messianic, Davidic dimension that he is anointed by God, and he has this special role to play. As we start turning into some of our audience questions, and again, feel free to keep putting questions in the chat, audience members, and we'll try to get to as many of these as we can. Somebody just wanted to clarify, because we covered a lot of ground early on. Is it true that Steve Bannon was the campaign manager for Bolsonaro?
Not officially, no. He was the campaign management for Trump, but he was in close connection, and he was a political counselor.
Okay.
In ways that was not officially.
But and an advisor working mostly with Eduardo Bolsonaro, Jair Bolsonaro's son, the member of Congress, and just for context. Bolsonaro has 3 sons who are politicians too, and they are, one is a senator, the other one is a Congress person, the other one is in the city council of Rio de Janeiro. But these 3 sons, they were heavily influential in everything that happened. They actually controlled a lot of the campaign. And one of them was closely working with Bannon, and not only Bannon, but Bannon especially. He posted a picture of attending Bannon's birthday party in 2018, before all of this. So it's a relationship that was cultivated as long as Bannon saw him a promising leader, younger, promising leader for the movement. And I think it would be difficult for Bannon to relate directly to Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro is not really a person who interacts a lot, especially outside of his native Portuguese language. So you see him in public events at the UN or with the Pope, always quiet, silent. And so his sons have been strong interlocutors for him. And in that sense, I think Bannon had an influence, direct influence over, it still has, because they were here just maybe a couple of months ago, over people like Eduardo Bolsonaro.
And just to be clear, there it's not only that there are close connections between the Trump political advisors and the Bolsonaro camp, right? The Steve Bannon types who are but there's also close connections between some of Donald Trump's religious advisors and Bolsonaro's camp. I've seen images of some of the evangelical advisors to Donald Trump, people like Jim Garlow, going down to Brazil, spending time with Bolsonaro, even taking pictures with Bolsonaro wearing a talit, right? A Jewish prayer shawl. We were talking about Christian Zionism and the ways that shofars and these expressions of support for Israel or kind of appropriations from Judaism that occur frequently in these neo-Pentecostal charismatic circles are also one of these unifying dimensions between these religious movements. So how is this manifestation, this is another audience question, how is this manifestation of Christian faith different from Catholic liberation theology? Because I know Raimundo highlighted that Catholic liberation theology has been an important element of thinking about religion and politics in Brazil. How would you compare and contrast some of these political mobilizations that we're seeing around right-wing causes with Catholic liberation theology?
João was the one who mentioned it, but
Okay.
let me just take a first shot at it. So I would compare more the religious expression that we see today with that Catholic reaction of the 1930s, with the family property and tradition movement of the 60s, which was also strongly appealing to the Catholics, because it's a movement of that sees Christianity in the control. So Christianity as a faith, as a religion, is prioritized and has the right values for the entire society. And what they are trying to do is to implement that, to make that work in a practical way, moving from a discourse, moving from preaching to acting in that sense. In the case of liberation theology, there was a clear understanding that they were part of a broader society that was plural. They are associated with other popular movements, and they were looking for, yes, they are similar. They were looking for transformation of society, just as this movement is, but they were not anti-democratic. They were actually fighting for what they call the radical democracy. Radical democracy in the sense of actually getting democracy to work for the less favored, for the most vulnerable, for the victims of systemic injustice. In that sense, so there are similarities in the sense that both of them are calling for action, calling for praxis. The difference is how that praxis is implemented and occurs.
You know, I agree with that, and I'll just come back to something that Matt was saying previously, that in Raimundo also, in terms of the U.S. Brazil kind of networks and connections, that when we were there interviewing the head of the Evangelical Caucus in Congress, he mentioned that he had a breakfast with Capital Ministries coming up.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was next morning, right, Hamund, or something like that.
The next day, yeah.
The next day, yes, just to kind of highlight how these transnational connections remain strong and organized.
And Capital Ministries is a ministry that is dedicated to working with lawmakers, and I believe it's run by Ralph Drollinger here in the U.S.
Exactly.
But now you're starting to see it kind of having more of an international influence and working with legislators in other countries. That's fascinating.
Their international influence grew exponentially during the Trump administration because of people like Mike Pence and others in the administration who actually used their relationships to give them connections with governments in South America, and especially the Brazilian government. And their slogan was convert the first. So it's the idea that the first are the ones on the top, the leaders. You evangelize the leaders, and everything will fall into place.
In the U.S., you often see this in conversation among evangelicals, that you need to target the kings. The kings of society, exactly. Influence will flow down, right? And so there's this differing strategy now that's not only about grassroots mobilization, but about trying to either install Christian nationalist leaders or convert leaders who are already in office to a Christian nationalist agenda to transform society from the top down. So it sounds like there's a very similar dynamic. We're almost out of time, so this is going to probably be our last question here. That is in some ways the question. What do we do? Right? You have these authoritarian forces and mobilizations that are going on. Have you seen anything in Brazil that has been effective at pushing back against these movements? What have you seen, either internal within Christian circles or within society, that is pushing back and challenging these dangerous elements, anti-democratic elements?
No, that's the question. I will mention that that another important element of this conversation is that we also have coming out of Pentecostal charismatic circles and other circles within Christian communities, a resistance movement also that continues to organize and to try to exert influence. And I think that being aware and supporting those movements are important in bringing awareness to what's happening, but also working to organize groups of people that in some ways share a similar lexicon, but can offer alternative imaginations to those conversations. I wonder what Raimundo has to say about that.
Yeah, I go in the same direction. And my book, Protesting Poverty, it shows those examples in many ways. This is smaller, and that's the thing. People are not paying too much attention because they seem to be smaller in size and numbers. But they are, I think that's where my hope is. Last year, at this time, during the day, I was visiting those women. And so we left that place so encouraged by the work that they were doing, to be suddenly shocked and discouraged by what we saw happening in Brasilia. But I think it's very important to understand that these are not the only game in town, and that we need to know, as João say, and we need to support these movements of resistance to the best of our capacity. Those of us doing scholarship, we need to highlight them. We need to make sure that people get to know them. And those who can in any capacity connect with them, form alliance with them, support them. I think that's the way to have an alternative, which has been the history. If we talk about the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, throughout that period, there was always a movement of resistance, smaller in size, but which at some point in history, they also had an impact.
And this is one of the great challenges of pluralistic democracy that includes religious freedom, is you need freedom for Christians and any people of any religion to organize and to be politically involved and all. But then at the same time, religious movements and religious nationalist movements have often been anti-democratic. And so how do we maintain that balance of religious freedom? I think a lot of it comes down to conversations between different kinds of religious actors, an intra-Christian dialogue that needs to occur. And it sounds like it's occurring somewhat in Brazil. It definitely needs to occur here in the United States, because this is a civic challenge in many ways, not a legal challenge. I just want to say thank you so much, João. Thank you, Raimundo. We're at the end of our time, but I just, again, to our audience and to anyone who watches this video on YouTube, follow these two men, follow Erica Ramirez, follow them on social media, follow their scholarship, read their books. They are just doing phenomenal work and really important topic. Look for the Apocalypse in the Tropics, which will be coming out this year, this documentary that they have both contributed to greatly. I just want to highlight, as we wrap up, my colleague Katie just put a survey in our chat. You will hopefully receive one by email as well if you participated in this event. Please fill it out. We take your feedback very seriously, and we are always looking to improve our programs and to tailor them to things that people are eager for. And I also just want to mention, coming up this month, we have ICJS has put together a documentary about January 6th called Spiritual Warriors. That we are going to be doing, if you're in the Baltimore area, we're going to be doing a screening of that on the 31st of January at the Senator Theater that you can sign up for on our website. And we'll have a panel discussion about the film as well. And then that film will then be posted on YouTube afterwards. So if you aren't in Baltimore or aren't able to be there, please know that you'll have access to that documentary very shortly after the event. And then I also just want to highlight, we're going to be doing a course on Christian nationalism that I will be teaching starting next month. You can sign up for that. And we'll also be doing an event next month in person in Baltimore with a screening of another documentary called Three Chaplains that my colleague, our Muslim scholar, Zainab Sailgan, we'll be facilitating a conversation about. So there's a lot coming up, both in person and things that you can do online. Please log into our website, sign up for our email updates, and stay posted. And again, thank you so much, Raimundo. Thank you, Joao. Fantastic conversation, really interesting stuff.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
And thank
Yes.
you all for joining us.